In this lesson, we're going to finish our discussion of the agricultural industrial changes that took place within Communist China between 1949 and 1965 by focusing on the Lushan Conference. Now, this conference really gave us the major change and the major shift away from these ideological positions presented by Mao and into a little bit more realistic positions for the economy. And we also see Mao take a bit more of a step back from the day-to-day running of the state of China, until he then makes his return with the Cultural Revolution. So, really, like I said, it's really where we start to see somewhat of a turning point in terms of the economic policy during this period. And so, it was also the time, as I also mentioned, where Mao takes a step back from the day-to-day running of the country. And something that is obviously very positive for the people who lived in the country, considering that there had just been the worst famine that had ever of the 20th century and potentially in all of history. And so during the conference, what actually happened? Well, firstly, there were doubts that were raised as to the success of the collectivization policies. Now, the Great Leap Forward as well was one of the things that really had a number of detractors, shall we say, and this was mainly done by one of Mao's trusted party ministers, that being the Minister for Defense, Peng Dewaohui. Now, Peng Dewaohui has a particularly tragic history in terms of what happens from when he becomes Minister of Defense and then into his death, because he becomes one of the main victims of the Cultural Revolution. But Dewaohui regarded himself as somebody who thought that they were being able to raise the concerns about the extent to which agricultural harvests were being exaggerated, for a start. That's one of the major problems that we remember from the Great Famine and the collectivization policies that we have. And he believed that because of his close relationship that he had with Mao, because of the fact that he was a loyal follower of Mao and somebody who had fought in the Civil War, should I say, that they would be able to raise these concerns and be able to actually and not be shut down by these concerns and not actually maybe have some kind of impact on the direction of policy. But in reality, what Mao saw this as was a betrayal. And instead of actually implementing or listening to any of what Dewaohui actually said, he replaced him with an even closer ally, and that being Lin Biao. So it was very clear that the cult of personality still existed. It was very clear that Mao was not somebody who was particularly open to criticism, as you can probably imagine. And one of the things that it was very clear, though, was the fact that Mao would be unable to run the day-to-day politics for the state for a while as a result of these failures in economic policy. So even though there existed this cult of personality, and even though there existed this sense that Mao could do and say no wrong, because he was the great leader of the Chinese Civil War, and he was the great communist, the bringer of communism, and he was also seen as somewhat of a hero as a result of the Korean War. All of these things were overshadowed by the fact that during the collectivization failures and during the Great Leap Forward, between 20 and 50 million people had died. And so as a result of all of these things, Mao would take a step back, and it would be left to Liu and Deng to introduce new economic reforms. Now, these two would not be in the spotlight for particularly very long, because they will also become targets of the Cultural Revolution that we will see in the next few lessons. But before then, we have a certain number of quite significant economic reforms, and we've touched on them very briefly when we looked at the Great Famine in a previous lesson. But these reforms took place between 1962 and 1965, and the main problem that we really started to see change was the release of the ideological ties that had plagued industry for so many years. All of the different terrible ideas seem to be relating to not only some quite bad ideas relating to communism more broadly, but the ideas relating to the ideological implications of these policies. So things like Lysenkoism and this idea that that the ways in which agriculture is operated is actually just a capitalist bourgeois propaganda, and really Lysenkoism is this communist view of agriculture that is actually better, which actually turns out to just be false. And similarly, when it came to industry, there was all these ideological ties that still existed. And so rather than trying to rely on the success of some kind of ideological commitment, the shift was away from ideology to more this idea that industry should exist to make profit. And so there was also a slight shift in industrial output, with the main aim to focus on the production of materials that were needed to help with agricultural growth. So rather than having this direction where we see agricultural growth feeding into industrial development, we saw a little bit more of a shift back the other direction where industry would actually feed more into agricultural growth. So we would see industry create materials needed for having a stronger, more stable, more robust agricultural policy. Because essentially, if there is no agriculture, then there is no way for the Chinese population to be fed, and as a result of that, you see many, many, many deaths. The size of the communes within agriculture also were reduced greatly, and peasants were also given the opportunity to grow what they wanted rather than what the party had demanded, and they were allowed to sell surplus on a market for profit. So there was this sort of introduction of slight market reforms in this particular system, the results of which were economic growth essentially across this entire period. So by 1965, industrial output had nearly doubled the output that was recorded in 1957. So we see a doubling of the output from at the lowest point of the Great Leap Forward and the Great Famine. And in terms of light industry, we saw an increase of around 27% each year from 1962 into 1965. Heavy industry was very similar, with an increase of 17% each year, again between 1962 and 1965. One of the other things that really relates to the ideological implications of this, and a policy that really Mao should never have implemented, was this idea that the anti-rightist campaign was one that was a failure. So if you remember back to some of the earlier lessons when we talked about the ways in which Mao dealt with his political opponents, or people who he saw were political opponents, the anti-rightist campaign saw a number of experts in fields such as agriculture and fields such as industry being sent off to the prison system that existed, the Laogai system. And so one of the major shifts was a returning of these experts from the Laogai system back into managerial positions so they could actually do the job of operating the economy in a sufficient and productive way. So it was an implicit assumption, or an implicit admission, shall we say, that the anti-rightist campaign had been a failure, which it had been, and so therefore we see more and more people who were experts in this field be given these managerial positions. We also see a growth in private property in the 1960s as well. If you remember back, Mao, being very, very keen to implement collectivization, started off very slowly with mutual aid teams and production cooperatives, and then became a little bit almost impatient with the ways in which collectivization was taking place, and instead just opted for an abolishment of private property. Well, the 1960s saw a reversal of that policy as well. We see a reversal of the amount of the complete abolition of private property to an increase in private property as well, giving more market freedoms to these individuals who are going to be able to sell grain on markets and be able to work harder and work more productively, also be able to buy and sell and grow their own crops or whatever crops they want to grow, which also allowed for greater prosperity. And also doing away with the ideas related to the science of agriculture, things like Lysenkoism, these ideas that were just patently false as well, were also implemented too.